Alright YouTube, it's time to talk about the rise of occultism, analyzing it a little bit further than just, oh, well, the internet's there and so lots of occult manuscripts are there. Both, hardcover leather-bound editions for anyone who wants to order them in the mail on basically any subject ever. Hardcover editions that are a little less expensive, softcover editions that are really cheap, digital copies, free transcriptions of various documents. That certainly helps. That's one part of a trifecta that's led to the situation that we're in now, in which we're undergoing an out-and-out occult renaissance. The other parts are social alienation on a relatively large scale, partially because of the increasingly secular Western culture, as well as sort of the more morbid fundamentalists that you find in the Middle East especially, but also any part of the Islamic world for the most part, certain parts of the Christian world, some of the more fervent sort of cultish activities that are sort of spin-offs of these groups. You think of like the Destiny cult or something like that from South Africa. They shave their heads and they pretend to channel spirits and stuff, and it's all very fun. It's also an obvious cult, literally led by a cult leader who's sort of like Jim Jones or something like that. And then you have the uncertain global state as well. And what I see is are similarities between the modern age and sort of the dawn of the printing press era, or perhaps the early interwar period. You've got a situation in which a large number of people around the world feel alienated. And part of that alienation is inherently going to be aimed towards the dominant either secular or religious groups that they see as being involved with the power structure of their countries, as well as foreign powers. We saw this with the rise of Nazi Germany. There was a Volkisch movement that preceded the Nazi movement, specifically. Several decades before, groups, sort of secretive mystery schools and occult orders rose up to discuss philosophy, intertwined with politics, Bavarian groups especially. This was common at the time. At the same time, the lay people, because of especially economic stress, increasingly turned to the occult because there wasn't the widespread availability of some of the rudiments of modernity that had been available prior. For instance, you think of a group of people who have relatively little access to inexpensive, to affordable modern medicine. They may turn to herbal medicine. People who have they experience relatively little solid, reasonable governance, control over aspects of their lives, if they want control at all. They turn to sort of the religious structures, but they forsake the standard religious structures, which are very boring, and they turn to something that's more exciting, the mystery schools, the occult movements, and so forth. And the internet has figured into this in a much larger manner. In the interwar period, with the social alienation, the economic worldwide downturns there, and the abandonment of what had been seen as traditional Abrahamic religion in Europe, corresponded with people gobbling up this literature. But it was being printed at greater expense. You didn't have digital copies. You didn't have free transcriptions. These things really didn't exist at the time. Now they do. And so it's being disseminated several orders of magnitude more effectively than it ever was in that period. And even then, post sort of printing press era, it was much more efficient, it was much quicker, it was much easier and cheaper in many ways than it had been centuries before. In the days of the Black Death or something like that, when again, you had the same social alienation, you had the same uncertain future, and you had increasingly people abandoning what was then considered standardized religion. They abandoned Catholicism in many cases. They turned to the people who are flagellating themselves or something like that as sort of their savior. They turned to some of these mystic movements or these cultic movements that were offshoots in some cases of the mainstream religion that redefined it, reinterpreted it. Or they turned to other things, or they reverted into paganism. There were tales at the time, for instance with the Black Death, that people, especially in the Italian peninsula, in the northern Italian region, I think this leads directly to the folkish tradition that informed the erratia of Leland several centuries later. What happened is that people, because order broke down, It was essentially anarchy for the most part. Because the population had thinned out so much, and because there were so many surplus goods, especially things like wine or anything that could store for long periods for the now significantly decreased population, people roved around in groups, and they went and they had orgies and parties and drunken revelries in all these mansions where the rich people had either fled into the countryside to avoid the coming plague, or they had died already. So people would literally, they'd just go and inhabit whatever home they wanted. They'd steal from one another in a wanton manner, and order broke down. And it was sort of like the Mask of the Red Death sort of feeling. Here are these people having these drunken, orgiastic revelries. Meanwhile, everybody around them is dying, because they no longer really had a fear of it. They figured, well, I'm going to die anyway. I'm going to live it up until I do. And in the same way, I think I see a parallel now with the modern age. Because of the alienation, because of the near certainty of nuclear annihilation, it's gotten to the point where people almost welcome it, and they're delving into the more materialistic aspects of the occult therein. There are also those who, as a different variant of escapism, it still is a form of escapism psychologically speaking, they delve into the more philosophical, the more hopeful, perhaps optimistic side, forsaking the materialistic aspect necessarily of the occult, and simply delving into the academic side, attempting to fathom the great mysteries of alchemy or something like that, or the great philosophers. And it's because of the ease with which this material is now disseminated. Most of it's available for free for somebody who wants to read it. If they want to obtain cheap physical copies, the physical copies inexpensively are there. I help add to this fire myself through my own editing work and my own authorship. What ends up happening is that it's very easy for people to study the occult now. A couple decades ago, it was far harder. Most of this material wasn't available. Most of the websites that now disseminate it didn't exist. There was no YouTube, there wasn't a Twitter, there wasn't a Facebook or a Snapchat or anything. Social media wasn't around yet. That's number one. So information transfer was not instant. It was far slower unless you were on a very primitive chat site, which didn't necessarily allow you to send files back and forth, effectively. Number two, back then computer systems weren't able to handle some of the truly good scans we're talking about now as far as even file size goes. 5 or 6 of the PDFs that I myself have scanned, being relatively short but also high quality, would have filled up the entire hard drive of the average Windows 95. And so 20 or 25 years ago, back when I'm a really little kid, we didn't really have this information available. If it was there, it was plain text, no images or very, very low quality images. It was spotty at best as far as the availability of these documents. It isn't really until the late XP sort of Vista era that you get truly all of these works compiled online available for people. And what that's done, I've seen it myself, has led to the massive expansion of neo-pagan movements, of any form of occult variants. That is, any occult school, any occult literature, the popularity of any occult author, the popularity of the subject matter entirely, to the point at which there is an enormous number now. There are an enormous number of people who are publishing their own occult materials, who are going back and looking at older occult materials, synthesizing and analyzing it. You've got the proliferation of websites dealing with this. Meanwhile, the Christian or Islamic and all of these other movements are kind of stuck in the Stone Age. Some of them still debate over whether the internet is even a force for good or not. And so you have, for every sort of progressive movement within one of these religions that's actually making use of it, you have another that's sort of forsaken the very idea and sort of appears as a bunch of Luddites or something like that. The occult has no problem with these things. But the social alienation and the uncertain global state, perhaps, are foremost in this respect. You've also got, in some parts of the world, the deep parts of the third world, we're talking Southeast Asia, we're talking parts of Africa, certain parts of Latin America and the Caribbean, the Eastern Europe certainly, are beginning to develop more quickly now. And with higher general literacy, a greater proportion of the population at least partially literate in English, a greater proportion of the population connected to the internet, those areas of the world that even a few years ago weren't really absorbing occult material now are fully connected in many cases with the occult. For instance, we would think Africa is probably the best example, West Africa specifically. We're talking the Nigeria, Ghana, Togo and Benin, the Ivory Coast sort of region, Liberia, Sierra Leone. This area, I've never seen such fervor among a group of people from any specific geographic region with regards to black magic especially than I see from that part of Africa. There's much greater fervor and there's much less, it seems, cultural restriction on doing harm through magic than you would find even in the most hedonistic of European movements. That is, it seems to be taken as normal that would be a usefulness within magic. And so as these areas, especially Nigeria and Ghana, continue to develop at a relatively rapid pace, Nigeria based partly on the oil industry, Ghana for agricultural exports and some of these things, these two states doing relatively well, especially by African standards, especially West African standards. They're beginning to gobble up all of this inexpensive occult literature. The sums proposed are enormous as far as sales go to this region of the world of some of these sort of materials. I have no doubt that a lot of the copies of the Grand Grimoire that I've sold, because it's a diabolical work, or the Grimorium Verum, or the Clavicula Salomonis, or any of these things, I'm sure that a fairly large proportion are going to somewhere in Africa, which is a good thing. This part of the world is perhaps now at the forefront of the occult renaissance, because as more people hook up to the internet, there are more people researching this material. It would also be interesting to see if in the near future you get a more African inclusion of folkish rites within the lexicon of occultism from some of these backgrounds, some of these, in some cases, very small regional or tribal traditions that have never even been studied. And certainly there would be people within Africa with an academic bent to their mind who would love to compile and release that material. I've got some handwritten manuscript that's been scanned of a folkish herbal from Scotland from centuries ago. I'm sure that there are similar works within African lore that could be easily translated by somebody who's aware of those sort of tribal dialects into English. And it'd be interesting to see. The same happens in Asia. I've seen several different scans of documents. I think one was from Tibet, if I remember, and another was actually from Cambodia or something. And they're like herbals, sort of shamanistic little ritual guides. Some have to do with burial, often with healing or protective magic, some with cursing or hexing your enemies for war or whatever. These are relatively common all over the world. What they have in common is that nobody has had the infrastructure available to translate or transcribe these in many cases. Well, now it exists. So you're going to see more and more and more literature enter the occult lexicon for the first time as well. It's an excellent place for people to get together on the internet, to research these things together and to transcribe, to translate, to release materials as part of a concerted effort. But I think first and foremost in the occult renaissance of the modern era, that is the present era from about 5-10 years ago to right now, I think a lot of it has to do with the alienation of many populations in the increasingly secular parts of the world to mainstream religions. And some people, as a show of rebellion against their dominant culture, switch from Christianity or secularity to Islam. But I think a larger proportion are taking up some of these sort of folkish rites. And in many ways, it's almost a multicultural movement. I know I give multiculturalism a lot of flack, and in a social and a political sense, it should be given flack, because it doesn't work. But within the context of the occult, where these things are being released, they're being edited and translated and so forth, I have no problem with that. I've absorbed materials from many parts of the world, from many different cultures, and they all have something to say. They're all very much interesting to me. As far as the spiritual world goes, it should be cosmopolitan. These materials should all be collected. They should all be translated into every language. They should all be available as free PDFs, and they should also be available in various print editions as well. That's my belief, and that's what I try to strive towards. I wish I could get together with people who know other languages to release editions of some of these works in other languages. I wish I knew somebody who knew Arabic so I could release a copy of the Picatrix, because of course the only English edition is copyrighted. It was released in the 80s from the Al-Ghiyat, and the original's in Arabic. You can obtain the Arabic copy, and that's out of copyright, but it has to be translated. So I'm sort of stuck between a cock and a hard place with some of these materials, except those that came from either the English or the French-speaking world to begin with some time ago. But the occult renaissance, I believe, will continue, because I don't see an end in sight anytime soon to the social alienation, certainly, number one. And any right-wing backlash is probably going to lead to the rise of neo-pagan groups anyway, so it wouldn't matter. Number two, the economic situation that makes people feel more reliant upon the spiritual but not the mainstream spiritual, I don't see improving, because the world is beginning to get close to hitting a wall at which it can't really continue to grow that much more. That's going to cause, we will see that in our lifetimes. Those of us who are in our 20s or 30s, I'm 28, those who are, 25 to 35 will probably in their lifetime see the great slowdown. And when that happens, the behavioral sink that kicks in will utterly fuck this world to hell. Unfortunately, we're going to see that regardless of any other disasters or world wars or atomic annihilations that happen. That's why we're doomed. And it's that sense of impending doom that I think more and more people are picking up on that's helping to feed the occult renaissance. People want to escape from this sort of dystopian reality. They want to believe that magic is real, and so they're studying it. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. They're reading more, they're studying academic materials, they're opening themselves to new horizons within thought, and at the same time, at the very least, all these materials, even the most diabolical, are far less violent and far more positive for the world than anything that was ever written by a Christian, a Muslim, or a Jew. So I would say overall a very positive thing for the world that I see continuing at least for the next few decades. When we hit that great wall, this world is going to have to take draconian measures to solve the problem. Unfortunately, all of these draconian measures require either tyranny or cultural suicide. That's why we're screwed. That's why the occult will continue to rise in dominance. And then you will see the world slip backwards, temporarily, into a slumber. The population will collapse, assuming that nothing else has caused it to collapse. And the world, for several generations, will be torn asunder. That's what will happen within the end of our lifetimes. We're talking, in the next 50 years or so. Very unfortunate, and it's not like in Malthus' day where they were talking about population density with the technology available then. We're talking about maximum comfort capacity as far as how close humans can live in proximity to one another without their hormones flying around and interfering with one another's sex drives and mood. Totally different issue. That's about all. Peace out.